Welcome, everyone, and we're so pleased to have you participate in today's program sponsored by the Plant Initiative, Conversing with Leaves, Plants, Politics, and More Than Human Witnessing, with Uriel Orlow and moderator Giovanni Alloy. I'm Paul Moss, Executive Director of the Plant Initiative, and I'm very excited to introduce Uriel and Giovanni and to start off our one-hour program. Dr. Uriel Orlow is a Swiss-born artist with a diasporic background who lives between Lisbon, London, and Zurich. His work has been shown widely in museums, galleries, film festivals, and exhibitions worldwide. Uriel's projects engage with residues of colonialism, spatial manifestations of memory, social and ecological justice, blind spots of representation, and plants as political actors. His multimedia installations focus on specific locations, microhistories, and forms of haunting. Uriel teaches at the University of the Arts, Zurich, and at University of Westminster, London, as well as at Malmö's, Lisbon. Dr. Giovanni Alloy is an author, educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature and the environment in art. He is the editor-in-chief of EdTenai, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. Giovanni is the author or editor of several books, including, among them, Why Look at Plants, The Vegetal Emergence in Contemporary Art, and most recently, Vegetal Entwinements in Philosophy and Art, and Estado Vegetal, Performance in Plant Thinking. Giovanni has contributed to BBC Radio, PBS TV, worked at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London, and currently is USA correspondent for S Magazine. He is also a board member of the Plant Initiative. The program will start with a half hour of conversation between Uriel and Giovanni. For the remainder of the program, Uriel will be responding to questions posed by you, the attendees, that will be presented by Giovanni as selected from questions that are posted in the Zoom chat. So we encourage you to please suggest a question for Uriel to discuss by posting it in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. This program is being recorded and will be posted online on the Plant Initiative's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered. With that, I'm turning over the program to Giovanni.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Uriel, and everyone here today. It's wonderful to have Uriel as our guest. And for those of you who have not encountered Uriel's work before, he's one of the most exciting and interesting artists who's been working on the subject of plants and culture and ecology over the past 15 years. So I'll pass it over to Uriel to introduce some of his projects for us, and then we'll begin a conversation.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Giovanni. And thanks for everyone who's here. I'm really happy to share this moment with everyone and also to have a conversation. We decided that I'll present briefly 4 projects and then we start the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen for that. Right. So you should be able to see that now. So I wanted to talk about a number of works. As Giovanni said, I've been working for a number of years around the idea of plants being political actors, being historical actors, not just backdrop to life and history, but actually also sort of actively involved. And so I've selected a number of works where we can think about that in specific ways. What we can see here is an image, a black and white image. It's actually a negative image of a wild almond tree in Cape Town. This tree was planted in 1660 when the Dutch settlers first arrived at the Cape looking for a place to replenish the ships that were coming back from South Asia, from India, with new wares and returning to Europe. and they would run out of fresh provisions on the way because it's a long voyage around Africa. So they were looking for a place where they could replenish the ships. And actually, what they did, the first thing that they did, and the first kind of act of the colonial project, was the creation of a garden called the Company's Garden, after the VOC company, which was producing fruit and vegetables for the ships. And this garden was situated in what is now Cape Town. And it was on a land that was already used by an indigenous population, the Kwekwe, for their grazing cattle. So the cattle would also be happy eating the salads that the Dutch were growing in the company's garden. So what they did was plant this wild almond tree, which grows as a kind of hedge. You can see here its branches are interlaced, and they planted a kilometer-long hedge around this garden to protect it from the animals. So in a sense, the planting of this tree can be considered one of the first acts of colonial violence and exclusion of the local population. And of course, trees are older than us. They remain around for much longer. So this tree is still around. So it's an interesting kind of example of a tree that was a plant, a tree that was actively involved in the colonial history of South Africa, and is also a witness to that history. So I've been thinking around what this witnessing means and what is a plant witness. And of course, a plant witness is not necessarily like a human witness. Plants do not speak. And we need to be also careful when we speak about plants in this way, that we don't ventriloquize, that we don't make them ventriloquize, that we don't anthropomorphize them. So what I'm interested in is kind of what happens in this space in between the tree and us. So thinking about this more than human witnessing as a kind of, through the idea of an articulate collective, that it's not just the tree on its own, and it's not just us who are doing the memorial work, but it's happening in this kind of collective space. And I think it's an interesting challenge to history, that history is not just recorded with through humans and with mediums that we invent, but that nature and plants are also records of history. I'm just going to maybe show a few more images from this series. This one is a poplar tree that stands in Johannesburg, and it stands next to where there was a house of an anti-apartheid activist who would give her house, Ruth Fisher, who would give her house as a kind of safe house for fugitives from the police, from the security forces. So when people were running away from the police, they were told, you should go to Ruth Fisher's house. You'll be safe there. Look for the tall poplar tree, and her house is next to it. So this tree literally saved lives. And it's an unmarked monument. It's an inadvertent monument. There is no sign, there is no plaque. But at the same time, it is a sort of monument. This tree is a milkwood tree that also stands in Cape Town. It's over 500 years old, and a lot of things happened in relation to this tree. It was actually this spot, it was under this tree where slave masters were bartering away humans, and the disobedient slaves were hung from this tree. It was also there where, after the Cape Colony was ceded to the British after the Boer War, the treaty was signed. So it's also become known as the treaty tree. So again, it has a violent history. It's haunting our present. So I'm also thinking of these trees as ghosts, as kind of a presence of the past in the present, as maybe unfinished business from the past that we need to look at. And it's for this reason that the work itself uses this form of the negative, the photographic negative, which is a kind of it's a latent inscription of an image. So you have like a chemical emulsion, a film, and the image is inscribed on it, but it's not visible yet. It needs to be processed, and then you get a negative, and then you can print the photograph. So the work itself is shown as prints of the negative. And this shows the installation. I wanted to talk about another work, which is called Learning from Artemisia, and it's about this plant, which is Artemisia afra, and which grows in most of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a close relative of another plant called Artemisia annua, which has become quite famous, which was first discovered after the Vietnam War. It's a plant that was part of Chinese medicine for a very long time. It was used to treat fevers. And during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong would supply this plant to, the Chinese would supply this plant to the Viet Cong in order to prevent and treat instances of malaria. And so there was a discrepancy between how much malaria there was with the American soldiers and with the Vietnamese soldiers. And after the war, research was done, and this molecule was identified as what medicine usually calls the active ingredient. And in this case, it was named after the plant, artemisinin. And a new generation of anti-malaria drugs were created that used three active ingredients, including this one. Of course, already the kind of older history of malaria drugs is connected to plants, to the cinchona tree that was discovered in Latin America, in Peru, and was then transported by the British to India and grown there. And from the bark of this tree, the quinine was harvested, was extracted, and this was also a mode of preventing malaria. But what happens in this classical way of doing medicine, what is sort of the modern way of doing medicine, is that the active ingredient that you see here is extracted, and it can be used in kind of an exact dosage. But what it means is that over time, the parasite, the illness, adapts to this active ingredient and becomes resistant to it. Now, the interesting thing about this plant, Artemisia afra, it is also being used in Africa against malaria, and it's both preventive and it can also treat the symptoms of malaria. And so research started to happen around this plant, and it became clear that yes, it works. But then the pharmaceutical industry and also the World Health Organization was not keen on its use, because it can't be used like a it can't be used like a conventional drug. It can't be dosed in the same way. Like, how would you get 1 milligram or 2 milligram of whatever the active ingredient is? And there was a fear that because it's also an Artemisia plant, it could even increase the resistance to the conventional drug. Yet the interesting thing is this Artemisia plant does not contain artemisinin, the active ingredient, and nobody knows why it works. So I worked with a women's collective in the south of Congo, in Lubumbashi, outside of Lubumbashi, and we created a garden in the city. So this women's collective, they produce this Artemisia as a tea for people to use. But in the cities, people do not know much about it because it can't be state funded, because there are no World Health Organization projects. So it's a kind of guerrilla gardening project in a sense. And so we decided to make a project as a garden to let people know about this plant. And we started growing it. We brought it from the fields outside of Lubumbashi. And then we worked on a mural that shows how it's used, like a manual, an instruction manual for the plant and the tea. And eventually I made a work that sort of comes out of that talks about the history of this plant. And I also worked with the husbands of these women in the women's collective, and we performed a song, which is a kind of sort of health ad for this. These are just some extracts of the work as it is shown in exhibition setting. And maybe I'll just show you a 2-minute extract of the song so you get a flavor of it.
Jeunes étoiles des As qui vous chantent un très bon produit qui traite actuellement en Afrique, en Europe, en Amérique, la malaria chronique. C'est l'Artemisia afra et l'Artemisia annua qui viennent du Vietnam et de la Chine. C'est une grande histoire, M. Orion pourra vous parler encore. Mais c'est l'orchestre Jeunes Étoiles d'Artemisia qui vous chante maintenant la chanson, la meilleure chanson d'Artemisia, Afra.
Nabondelio na bambongo, namolelie, 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 namolelie,
Okay, this was just to give you a little bit of a flavor. In the exhibition, I'm also serving the Artemisia tea, so people can actually taste it. And it's really the work is really trying to think about how plants do medicine and how this plant that doesn't contain the active ingredient, and we don't know why it works, it still works, and perhaps it works because it's a cocktail of ingredients. And specifically in Congo, there's a lot of minerals in the ground that could be part of why it works so well. And it's a kind of interesting superimposition because Congo is one of the most extracted places on the planet in terms of minerals. And so there is a plant that is also sort of making use of these minerals, but we can't just take it apart and use one aspect of it. We need to use it whole. The next project I wanted to briefly introduce is a project about how trees communicate with each other through the intricate root system that they have. And this root system is also a kind of, I guess, a sort of multi-species collaboration with fungi. It's called mycorrhizae, where the fungi basically help the plant absorb certain minerals, and the plant feeds the fungi with sugars that it produces through photosynthesis. And this is one of the oldest collaborations on the planet, and it's the basis of life, of practically all the life that we know. about 90% of all the plants are engaged in this kind of collaboration, but it's something that we don't see. It's underground, it's the roots. Suzanne Simard is one of the scientists who was talking about this, looking for the mother tree, how trees not only communicate with each other and use this to warn each other perhaps of dangers or how to react to certain situations, but they also keep certain trees alive. Even when the tree is cut or dead, the root system is kept alive and is fed through this intricate web. And as an artist, I'm interested in representation and how perhaps we can see things differently, or what we can see and what we can't see. So I was interested in this, root systems. Sometimes roots, a little bit of the root of a tree sort of appears above ground. So I really looked at these instances, and it's a sort of poem, I suppose. It's a paean to this collaboration, and you can see a little bit here. It's a dedication, but it's also about the dedication with which this collaboration happens. And I suppose the work is an invitation to think about more than human forms of collaboration, where we are sort of often trained to think about nature as a competitive system, as a kind of survival of the fittest, and perhaps to think that there are also other forms of life, of interspecies life, which could serve as examples to us. The last work I wanted to briefly talk about is thinking around plants and climate change. Specifically, I worked in Switzerland, and I worked with the Swiss National Park, who were doing research about high altitude plants, like around above 3,000 meters, at the top of the Swiss Alps. And they were doing very interesting research where they both collected historical data from the last 150 years of botanical expeditions that went to these mountain peaks and recorded what species were found. And they collated all this data and then revisited the mountain peaks. And what they found was that over the last 150 years, basically plants from lower down have started moving up. So what we see here is Piz Linard. It's one of the sort of mountain peaks in Switzerland. It's about 3,400 meters high. And it used to only have a few weeks of summer where plants could grow, and very specialized plants were growing there. And over time, with climate change, with the warming climate, summers got longer, the snow coverage got less, and plants that were further down started to move up. So this was interesting to me because, again, we don't think of plants as moving, we think of them as stationary. And these are kind of plants that are moving up. And it's a kind of result of climate change that happens far away from our gaze. And it invites us to create a different imaginary and a different kind of consciousness about climate change than the much more extreme images which we know from forest fires and floodings. These kind of very dramatic images. So I was thinking about what it means to produce new kinds of images that are not just about these moments of high drama, but things are going on all the time, and how can we engage with that? So I worked with one of the botanists, and we went up to this peak, and I observed her of doing this observation of seeing what plants were there. And then so with this peak, it turns out that in 1835, there was one species on the mountain peak, and now there are 17 species. So I also made drawings, and each expedition sort of has a new color. And then I was also thinking about sort of other ways of representing climate change through these climate stripes, where the colors represent the temperature, and we can see how over time, every year, the average temperature is represented with a color. We see this move from blue to red. I think this is maybe a good point to stop, and it gives us a basis to have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Uriel. So many well-chosen projects. You've got so many more. I certainly invite everyone to visit Uriel's website after this presentation. Maybe Paul can drop it into the chat. There's so many interesting and engaged projects. And one of the aspects I wanted to discuss briefly with you is that of collaboration, because I'm very much in awe of your ability to collaborate not only with very diverse partners, but also in situations in which you are not in your own element. So many of your projects entail traveling far from home to countries where you might not necessarily speak the language, or where you might not be familiar with customs. And I was just wondering if you could tell us something about your conception of collaboration with plants and people and places in your practice.
Thank you. I mean, I think for me, a lot of these collaborations, they come out of invitations. So there might already be an invitation for me to go somewhere and develop a project. So I'm kind of in the position of a guest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in this position, like, why might I be invited to this place? So this was the case, for example, in Lubumbashi in Congo, where I was invited to develop a project. I didn't just decide to go there. And then it means that I sort of, there's a kind of vulnerability that comes with that, with not being, as you say, in my own context, and speaking with people and relying on dialogue, relying on exchange. And even the story of this Artemisia afra plant, I only really found out about this because I was talking to somebody who said, oh, I've just recovered from malaria, and I was taking this tea for the first time, and it was amazing. And I said, oh, what's this tea, and where is it produced? And then I met the Women's Collective and started finding out about their work. And so for me, this is, yeah, it sort of means it sort of becomes multifaceted in terms of the forms of collaboration, where I've started working with the Women's Collective. I started working with this plant. So there's all forms of collaboration where different people also have different stakes. So for me, it was important to engage, for example, with the women and say, what would be useful for you to do in relation to this? Would it be useful to have a garden in the city, the kind of capital city of this area, so people know about your work and you can sell the teas, but also there is kind of more knowledge exchange. Yeah, so these kinds of things for me are quite important. That I suppose it's a decentering, and whether we work with plants or whether we're also working in different contexts, all of these are forms of decentering. We're not like the center of the world as humans, or as where I'm from, which is Europe. And yeah.
There's also, I think, an important point you made about asking who's invited you, what is it that I could do to benefit you in the end, which is different from traditional conceptions of a residency project or an invitation in which you produce an object that might follow you back where you originated from. I think there is something very interesting about the way in which you position yourself in these new territories and don't just follow the pathways that are being carved by the traditional conceptions of art making in a kind of modern sense during the 19th century in Europe. So I really admire that.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's really important. I think it's really important that we don't reproduce these models, as you say, the 19th century kind of traveler, or
Right.
a neo-colonial, I'm extracting something. So in this instance, for example, the collaboration or the entanglement also continues after I leave. So set up a model of a circular economy. So when this work is shown in the West or in Europe, and I get an artist fee, the women's collective gets the same fee as well. So it's not just I'm taking something and that becomes a work that circulates in the world, but it's actually, it continues to benefit all of us.
Yeah, I also know, having worked in the art world for many, many years, that all that you're describing, you make it sound so effortless, but there are so many negotiations behind the scenes, disagreements, and considerations that take up a lot of time. So it's just important to also evidence the fact that working the way you do is not easy. It's not like for everyone, in a sense. It requires, I think, a certain specific predisposition to negotiate and also to be patient, to be kind of able to listen and be present. There's something interesting about anthropomorphism, which is something I guess both you and I have worked in different capacities across our research. And I agree with you that it's extremely important. Like, one of the points you made in relation to the first project you presented, it was called The Memory of Trees, was in relation to the switching to negative. And you mentioned what it does. It adds this ghostliness, and it elevates, in a sense, the image of the tree to representing so much more that is not visible at first sight. There's also something interesting about the way in which it creates a different kind of beauty, I think, in the way you're not just reproducing a beautiful image of a tree, but you're transforming it into an icon of a kind of transcendental quality by just simply inverting the image. And I was wondering if you feel that there are times in which anthropomorphism of a certain kind might be productive and might be useful to your practice.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very difficult to avoid it completely. Like, once we talk, I mean, already when we talk about plants wandering up the mountain, of course, plants do not wander up the mountain like we do. Plants do not witness the way we do. So I think we are in some ways also constrained, and so it is useful to use anthropomorphism or to use certain forms of projection whilst being aware that that's what's happening. And what we're trying to do is actually also getting away from our own way of seeing things. But I think it helps us to perhaps get a sense of plant agency, whatever that might be, that would otherwise be much harder to grasp if we don't use certain words like wandering up or witnessing or whatever. Because argue that for plants to witness, they need to have a consciousness. And then we get into a whole other discussion. What is consciousness and what does that entail? Which is why I'm also sort of trying to think about this space in between, this kind of space of the articulate collective, where it's this collective between the plants and us that produces the witnessing and that produces the memorialization. It's not simply us projecting it, and it's not simply the plant sort of telling a history,
Yeah.
something in between.
Yeah, a co-evolution or a co-becoming that couldn't happen without the plant, right?
Yeah.
That's certainly one of the most, there's almost like you can argue that plants with their ability to withstand the elements and survive extremely long spans of time enable us to mark certain territories and certain ideas. And at some point, there isn't really a distinction between the territory and the idea. Both of them are sort of like interlaced and intertwined in a way that is interdependent. And I find, of course, the questions of aesthetics related to how can we fine-tune anthropomorphism extremely interesting, because like you say, I agree that in the end, we do need certain hooks, certain words that mobilize our feelings, our emotions, our empathy. And one of the aspects that the Plant Initiative is concerned with is the ethical treatment of plants, and how can we, in a sense, craft new models of ethicality that enable us to engage with plants in respectful ways, or in ways that take into consideration their sentience or their rights not to be destroyed or disposed of. So I was going to ask you if you have a set of parameters that you follow or mobilize when you're working that you can recognize perhaps as relational in the context of ethicality or in the context of respect of plants through your practice?
I mean, it depends, I guess, in what mode I'm working, because I've done a number of gardens, including the one that we just saw in Lubumbashi. I've also made a garden in Kathmandu. I've made a garden in London, in Dakar. So, and I guess in these instances, I'm always thinking about also what happens afterwards. Like, it's an art project, there's an opening, there's the garden that is visited, what happens to this garden after? So very often I'm trying to collaborate with communities, local communities that can also maintain the garden and want to maintain the garden. So in London, we worked with a community around an exhibition space called the Showroom in West London, where there is a kind of large migrant community, very mixed community, and we collected communal knowledge around medicinal plants and medicinal plant use from everyone's backgrounds, and basically ended up with 50 plants that people were using for different things from different traditions that we then created into medicinal plant garden. And the group, in a sense, sort of over time took over ownership of this garden. So the longevity is quite important to me. And I suppose in the work that is not actively sort of like growing plants, it's about trying to produce mindful images of plants that give plants, I suppose, a different status in our understanding of the world. And perhaps looking at certain aspects of plants that can produce new forms of relationships and awareness.
Yes, I very much agree with that too. I think there's a growing sense of responsibility. Your example of how you consider the aftermath of the exhibition, the future of the garden you create, I think is really important. I've come across institutions who have commissioned gardens in the past few years, not so long ago, with no question or consideration related to what happens next, and dismantling a garden that was created just as you clear up the gallery space after an exhibition seemed to be their default mode. But I've come across a couple of examples. You're a new one that I can add to my list of artists who have actually gone to institutions with that specific question, and we have to respect what happens afterwards with the plants and the space that we inhabit. There's actually an interesting question partly related to this by Issy Clark that I want to with you. And it's about plant vulnerability. New pests and diseases, local and general extinction, loss of pollinator, and so on. Have you worked with the idea of plants as victims? Perhaps not the right word.
It's a very interesting question. I think I haven't worked directly with plants as victims. I think I've worked more with, yeah, I suppose how plants were implicated in perhaps human victims like slaves who were hung from trees, or things like this, or how plants kind of are implicated in, yeah, certain colonial projects like I talked about. But the way that plants themselves fall a victim of what we do, which is kind of more a sort of question of the Anthropocene and how we're changing the planet, yeah, it's not something I've looked at so far.
That's interesting too, right? There's a consistent like flickering and shifting of all the roles that plants could allow us to explore and question. It's in that context that I'm interested also in another term that you've used more than once through this presentation, and is the notion of political actors. I'm interested in, your research is so far-reaching and very vertical at times. It seems that when you find your plant, you really dive deep into its history, traditions, and also chemical as well as biological aspects, ecological networks. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you negotiate, again, the tension between anthropomorphizing. I guess the notion of political actor might also be, in a sense, fragile in the context of that fear that we might be anthropomorphizing. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this idea of the plant as political actor comes about and what it entails in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's really thinking, I mean, it comes from thinking around agency and who has agency, and are humans the only living beings on the planet with agency, with a kind of will, with a way of doing things, or do other living beings also have forms of agency that might be different to ours, but that can affect us? And I mean, I suppose one of the kind of examples I sometimes give, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's the domestication of humans by wheat and rice, where we can actually think of the sort of history inverted. We often think of we domesticated wheat and we domesticated rice. But if you think of it from a plant's perspective, and you want to be a kind of successful plant, which means that you want to have a lot of offspring and grow widely, I mean, what cleverer thing to do than use humans to propagate? So to domesticate humans, as it were, to make yourself kind of grow further and wider. So we can think of this kind of agency in different ways. If we think of it from the perspective of wheat, and we say, well, wheat is like, and rice are amongst the most successful plants on the planet because they're grown so much, they're cultivated, they manage to use us for their advantage. So we've co-evolved, of course. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's just trying to think that the way we do things, it's not just one-sided. So once we start thinking about plants having some form of agency and doing things and moving up mountains and using humans to propagate and things like this, then we get decentered. And I think for me, it's about that. It's about thinking we are the most destructive force on the planet, and we think we are the only ones who have agency, but actually there are other actors around us, and we can learn from that, and we can also become more modest.
Yes, there's definitely also something interesting about the form of domestication that you've mentioned in reversal to our traditional conception of domestication that constantly happens in nature, is thinking about fungi who sort of seduce ants to propagate and replant spores in a way that ultimately benefits at some point the fungus more than the ant. There are different relationships of symbiosis in the natural world that can be used as a model for this inversion of domestication. And I think it's the more you look at those examples, the more the one that you've just described actually makes a lot of sense in terms of the possibility of re-seeing and rethinking the whole idea of who is impacting whom and the other way around. There's something also very interesting, I think, in the conception of media and how you use different media through which you explore your relationship with plants. So I was wondering, there's actually a question about domestication that might make sense right now, and then I'll return to the question of media. This is from Lorelei Hansen. Domestication of humans by corn would also be a good example, would it not? As the plant seed would all fall to the ground near the cob if it wasn't for human dispersal.
Yeah, sure.
I guess there is a question there about the domestication of the management of the seeds, right? And how you're right, Uriel, I agree with you that this sort of multiplication, if we assume that plants have a master plan and that the evolutional master plan entails world domination, which doesn't sound particularly good.
Well, that's our master
right?
plan we project onto plants.
Right. But if that's what the corn is trying to accomplish by getting us to disseminate the seeds, right, then the administration of the seeds also play a role there. And like, what do we do with these seeds? If we turn them into flour, then the ultimate, if there was a collective dispersed intention among the plans to get us to do something, that desire is frustrated. That makes any sense. It's very
sure. I mean, it becomes very complicated, and it goes even further. What if we start to create property out of certain seeds, like, I don't know, companies have been doing, like Monsanto has been doing with rice, with corn, with lots of different plants, where you're creating new varieties that you then patent, and what does that mean to have like ownership over a species?
Yeah,
I mean,
to even prevent those seeds from germinating
exactly
without the intervention of a chemical that is produced by that corporation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's another interesting question, I think, here by Maria Patricia Tinayero. Does your artwork seek to deepen our understanding and appreciation of the interconnectedness between humans and plants and soil while also addressing contemporary environmental challenges? And additionally, does it aim to challenge or dismantle the colonial legacies of Western thought in the context of environmental discourses and sustainable futures?
Yeah, I mean, it's a multifaceted question, and I think, I mean, I've just shown 4 works that do different things. It's impossible to do everything in one work, and I'm not sure it's desirable because it would overload the work. It would demand too much of one work to address everything. But I think over time, through my practice, I've been trying to think about and address various issues, including, of course, colonial legacies, including the colonial legacy of classification, where plants were kind of renamed, where after they were newly discovered by the European kind of scientists. And these plants were, of course, already known to the local population in different places. And with the renaming, a lot of local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, quite a lot of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge was lost as well. And that knowledge might have to do with certain medicinal properties, but it was part of a whole ecosystem of living with plants and the environment in general in a much more kind of equitable exchange, where it was not just about extraction, it was not just about control, it was not just about property. So whenever I've spoken to indigenous healers, say in South Africa, around questions of the protection of biodiversity and laws being introduced that make it impossible to harvest certain plants, they always say, well, traditionally, we've always been harvesting these plants and we make sure that the plant survives. It's a kind of capitalist system that turns plants into commodities that then drives kind of practices of overharvestation and potential extinction. So I think these things are completely interlinked, and we often, especially, I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in South Africa where we can see that practices of conservation have traditionally been quite closely linked to colonial practices of control, of administration, and that happens at all levels, and it starts with naming plants and giving them Latin names and putting them into the Linnaean system of classification, which is just one way of organizing the world. It's not the only way of seeing the world and organizing it. It's a very rational and stratified way, and it's also very gendered. And so there's lots of kind of questions around that. And I think all of these questions are connected. And I guess me as an artist, I'm trying to think about these things as I'm making work and trying to address maybe one or the other of these issues. It's impossible always to address everything, but I guess over the course of several projects, these connections between colonial histories and ecological problems and challenges that we face today and how they're connected become apparent.
There's also a related question by Fiona McDonald. I wonder what you think the increasing knowledge of the sentience and communicative interactions that plants form with each other, fungi, and etc., could or perhaps should have on the ethics of the way we garden and farm. Will we come to understand intensive farming of vegetables, of fruit, as cruel in the same way that we do animals?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I think it would need a lot of work in terms of making this research much more well known to a wider public, and to make people sort of have a much larger understanding of sentience. But I think that's where we should be heading. It's not something I've so much engaged with in my practice. I think it's a really interesting area of research, and it's really important because it does perhaps provide another argument against certain forms of intensive farming. But unfortunately, even with animal farming, where we know like how cruel it is and that animals are suffering, it hasn't stopped it from happening. So unfortunately, knowledge is not necessarily like always a weapon to prevent these things from happening.
Or there might be a longer span of time required for us to really come to grips with what the damages made really are. Although I agree with you that we have plenty of knowledge on what damage it does to the planet, to the animals, to us, and still we continue in the name of profit. We might have a couple more minutes. There's a question related to Artemisia by Catherine Melancon. As like your work with Artemisia, I'm also developing a body of work around the wonderful capabilities of plants, but I wonder if it's not another way of extracting and exploiting plants. How do we show our appreciation of plants, help develop our knowledge of them, and therefore respect, quoting Robin Wall Kimmerer, and their wonderful gifts without promoting plant only as something to use as productive? Do you have specific recurrent strategies to avoiding that?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it depends, like in each case, how we engage with the plant. I think if we sort of enter a tunnel and we just promote a certain aspect of the plant as being a benefit to us, then maybe it can sort of reproduce certain kind of extractive tendencies. But I think if we engage with it in a kind of much larger sort of ecology of collaboration with communities, with plants, it's part of a garden, there's part of a kind of aesthetic sort of context for me as well, which is important. It's not just about using it. And I think for me, even more so, what is important is trying to think about how plants do things, not just what they do for us, but what they do and how they do things. And of course, the fact that certain plants have medicinal properties, they haven't evolved to have these medicinal properties for us. These are like, it's a byproduct of the way the plant defends itself or is doing other things and is living within an environment. And what is interesting in this respect is that quite often it's weeds that, or what we consider weeds, which are pioneer plants that grow, that have a kind of certain strength to grow in spaces that maybe have degraded soils or poor soils or difficult conditions, are the kind of strong plants that have certain properties that allow them to survive in certain conditions. And it's precisely these properties that are also medicinal. So there's a sort of like interesting relationship between plants that we consider weeds or invasive or sort of, yeah, which are actually the plants that have a lot of interesting properties. And I think by changing perspective and valuing, so I've done a number of projects with weeds, and I think by changing kind of our understanding and these hierarchies that we set up, we're no longer in the kind of conventional relationship that medicine sets up. Oh, we have this plant, let's find the molecule, let's extract it, and we don't need the rest of the plant.
Thank you, Uriel. I dropped the website, Uriel's website, in the chat for everyone to carry on exploring his wonderful work, and I pass it over to Paul to wrap up.
Great. Thanks so much. Really, Uriel and Giovanni both did such a great job and just such an interesting and wide-ranging conversation. And thanks also to the audience members for sharing your questions and comments. This program has been one of a series of online events about the human-plant connection, and we're planning actually an additional program on July 24th with plant whisperer Rachel Corby, and we hope you'll join us then as well. So thank you both, everyone, for today for this wonderful program. And if you'd like to support these types of programs from the Plant Initiative, we're always appreciative of donations through our website. And I will send the recorded link to everyone, so you'll have that. And thanks again for being here today.
Thank you, Uriel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for being
Thank
here.
you.